there are certain guests you work a long time for, certain guests you spend, quite frankly, years waiting for and working towards. And this is one of those guests because as somebody that grew up watching a lot of news, both news in Connecticut, my home state, and also getting the New York City channels, a lot of New York City news as well. I've seen tonight's guest for years, so I'm very excited to talk to her. And a hat tip to someone that was featured on the show previously for helping set it up. You may remember Deputy Chief Joe DiBernardo, who was on for the Best of the Bravest, or FDNY miniseries. If not for him, I probably wouldn't have tonight's guest. So, Chief, if you're watching, thank you very much. I certainly do appreciate it. Someone that I know very well, and of course, tonight's guest as well. If you haven't checked out the previous episode, it's our longest show, but it was well worth it. Rich Miller, former NYPD Emergency Service Unit detective, who worked primarily in Truck 4 in the Bronx, was on, and it was a pleasure to have him on. A guy that has seen a lot and done a lot, was a Marine veteran as well, military policeman in the Marine Corps, and in emergency service responded to everything. TWA Flight 800, the Freddy's Fashion Mart massacre, of course, the September 11th, 2001 terror attacks, amongst other things. So go check that episode out if you haven't already. I see some people filing in already in the chat. Bill Ryan's here, retired NYPD detective at the Arson Explosion Squad. Jay Driscoll from across the pond. Joe Maliga from Rochester. And, of course, John Costello's tuning in as well. So we won't keep our guests waiting too long. We'll run a couple of advertisements. Before we get to those advertisements, apologies for the cancellation on Friday night. We were supposed to be speaking with Deputy Chief Al Prats for the Best, the Bravest Nationwide series. He had a family emergency he had to take care of. So that show has been rescheduled for Friday, September 27th. So be on the lookout for that one as well. All right, let's get rolling with the ads. And the first one is going to be MC Media Editing Services.
Need advice on how to start your podcast? Frustrated with the editing process? Can't find a voiceover guy? Hi, I'm Mike Colón, and I'm here to help. I'm the owner and founder of MC Media Editing Services, your premier consulting company for all things media, where I can offer you consulting advice on how to get started, and once you get started, editing, as well as voiceover work, all for a very reasonable price. If you want to reach me, you can contact me at 917-781-6189 or the email that you see listed here. I'm always available, and I'm always willing to help. Again, 917-781-6189. Why go to some giant consulting firm that's going to charge you an arm and a leg when you can just come to me? If you want to be stress-free, the way to go is to call MC. MC Media Editing Services, your premier consulting company.
And of course, speaking of Billy Ryan, we mentioned him earlier. We'll mention him again because he has the Ryan Investigative Group.
The Mike the New Haven podcast is proudly sponsored and supported by the Ryan Investigative Group. If you need an elite PI, look no further than the Elite Ryan Investigative Group, which is run by retired NYPD detective Bill Ryan, a 20-year veteran of the department who served the majority of his career in the Detective Bureau, most notably in the Arson Explosion Squad. So if you need a PI to handle anything from fraud, legal services, and anything else that you might require, contact Bill at 347-417-1610. Again, 347-417-1610. Reach him at his website or the email that you see here. Again, if you need a PI, look no further than Bill Ryan and the Ryan Investigative Group, a proud supporter and sponsor of the Mike to New Haven podcast.
All right. My next guest has been at the forefront of many a captivating New York story, ranging from the comedic to the soul-crushing. She's covered it all. A Queens native, she's a graduate of Queens College and has spent the entirety of her career in the Big Apple, most notably with WPIX, and also a stint as well at WCBS, but mostly WPIX for a combined over 30 years. She's a winner of several awards during the course of her journalistic career, and she's got no plans on slowing down, as she'll tell us about tonight. And that, finally, I get to say this after years of pursuing her. Joining us tonight on the Mike the New Haven podcast is Mary Murphy. Ms. Murphy, welcome. How are you?
Hi, Mike. You can call me Mary. It's really nice to be here. And Chief DiBernardo did put in a good word for you, so that helped. But you were persistent, and you have to be persistent in this business.
Yeah, I've learned that over the years. You know, those who are silent don't get. So, you know, closed mouths don't get fed. You have to be in hot pursuit. And as certainly the viewers and listeners of this program know, that's something I've been known to do over the years. So as I mentioned in my introduction of you, you're a Queens girl. Tell me about growing up in Queens during the early years.
I grew up on 220th Street in Queens Village, born in Woodside, but I'd say the foundation of my life, I'm the oldest of four, was on 220th Street, went to Our Lady of Lourdes Catholic School. I have a brother and two sisters, and a lot of what I learned there carried me through my career. You know, I realized I could write as a fourth grade student at Our Lady of Lourdes, and I went to a private high school in Jamaica, Queens College, 4 years, and stepped into the business through an internship that I saw up on the board in the communications department. And I was fortunate to be considered because they liked my essay about why I wanted to get into the newsroom. And I had 2 different interviews to get through, but got in February of 1981. So really was in the business in local TV for over 40 years, 43 years.
So let's take a step back a second. How soon in your life did that interest even begin in journalism?
I've told the story a few times. My mother, who's an Irish immigrant, used to watch Eyewitness News, Channel 7. And one day we were home. I guess I was about 13 years old, just in from school. And Roseanne Scamardello was the reporter that was on the tube. She was in a grocery store in the 1970s, and she was talking about inflation. Sound familiar? All these years later, we're talking about it. But she was comparing grocery prices week to week. And my mother saw this Italian-American girl from Brooklyn who seemed like an ordinary girl, like her daughter, me. And she looked at me and said, "You can do that." So a seed was planted, but I can't say that I really set in motion the events that would lead me to television until I saw that notice about the internship 8 years later.
Talking with Mary Murphy here on the Mike the New Haven podcast. And as always, for those of you, this is not available to those of you tuning in via LinkedIn, but if you're watching on YouTube, you can contribute in the super chat. And if you want to ask Mary a question, I'll highlight it at the appropriate time. So you mentioned that internship, and that's often a case where you could learn both directly and indirectly. And so, like I said in the introduction, this is a show that profiles a lot of police and fire. So I always like asking, slightly alter the question here. When you got on the job, who was the senior man or woman that helped you learn? So for you, just by sheer observance or by people speaking directly to you during that internship, what were the key lessons you picked up early on that guided you over the course of your career and you passed on to others?
Well, when I first started, there were unions there, and they still have unions. And so they didn't really want me answering the phones, especially during the week. But on the weekend, there was hardly anyone there. There was an assignment editor at the desk, Noreen Lark, and she would let me help answer the phones and make phone calls to the police department, the NYPD, because that's where a lot of the news came from. When there were crime stories, we pursued them, and that continues until this day. And so that was my start in terms of making phone calls. And then I started as a researcher, and I was helping with some of the year-ender stories that were done in late 1981. But I had been told that if I wanted to stay in town and not leave where I lived, I would probably have to go to a smaller station. A lot of people went out of state, but I went to Pix 11. I got an interview there. And I should note that my step in the door, I did on my own. I got that first internship. But that second interview, my brother helped me with, because my brother had gone to Regis High School, which was an all-scholarship Jesuit school in Manhattan. And he started in the business when he was 17 years old. I call him the boy wonder. His name is Jim Murphy. But he told someone at Pix 11 that I was a hard worker. And so I got the interview with Bill Littauer, the executive producer, and I started at the bottom, production assistant, and then worked my way up over the course of 5 years during my initial time at Pix.
And we saw that. So originally, as you mentioned, it started out with that internship. And, originally it was a hand in production as well. And I want to stay on production for a second before I get to your transition ultimately into reporting, because as I've covered before with several news reporters who I've had the pleasure of interviewing on this program, the most unsung individuals in the business at times, besides the reporters themselves, are those behind the camera, because so much work goes into getting the show on the air in the first place. So spending some time in production, as I believe you did, tell me about what that taught you and the appreciation it gave you for just that, the efforts those behind the camera put in to get the show on the air.
Well, there are so many grunt type jobs that, some people may not want to dirty their hands with. But when you're a production assistant, and back in the day, before we had computers, we had typewriters. And I used to have to change the ribbons, the black ribbons with ink on the Associated Press teletype machines. So there would be maybe like 6 machines in a room, and 2 of them would be for national news, 2 for international, and 2 for local. And the reason for that is that when you were changing the ribbon on one machine, the other one had to keep going. You didn't want to miss anything. So I remember how nervous I was starting out, having to change these ribbons, even just trying to work the copy machine. I'm not technically astute. That's not my thing. But one time I messed up the copy machine, but I was very good and diligent about getting the tapes in order, running them to the tape room so they could be put on the air. You may have heard of the movie Broadcast News. when they would be racing tapes down the hall to try to make the deadline. Well, I did that racing. So I really related to that particular film. And then the step after production assistant was writing, just being able to write a story for the show. And, so I was shy at first. I was a little nervous about bothering the editor, but I used to ask her. And then one day, I'll always remember this, Princess Grace of Monaco. She was once a film actress who won an Oscar, Grace Kelly from Philadelphia. And when she became the princess, everyone was still interested in her because she was an American. And she had a really bad car accident in the early 80s. And, we were hearing at first that, she was in a coma. We weren't quite sure the extent of her injuries. They let me write the lead story the night that it became very clear that she was probably not going to make it. So that was the first lead story that I wrote, which was an international story. It wasn't a local story. And then after that, they wanted production assistants and writers to come up with ideas for special series that they could put on during the ratings period. And Ronald Reagan was the president at the time. And back then he was the oldest president who had ever served. And of course that's changed now.
Yep.
But I had this idea about doing a series on aging in America because I had worked in a nursing home through high school and college. And I knew that there were all kinds of issues associated with getting older in America. Some people didn't want to stop working. Some people couldn't afford to live on their own. So we were seeing an explosion of 3-generation households. So I proposed this series and was allowed to do everything, the research, the writing, the interviews. The only thing I wasn't allowed to do was the narration. That was left to a reporter on the air. But it got nominated for an Emmy Award, and I was only 23 years old. It didn't win, but to be nominated was great, and I was promoted to full-time writer.
That's only a year younger than I am now, which is crazy to think. It's about the same age that I am now. So to have that early on, that has to feel, obviously it feels great, but it has to let you know, okay, I belong here. Because naturally, whatever the profession is, early on, you're trying to find your footing, and it doesn't happen overnight. Very few people hit the ground running in that way. So to have something like that, talk about reaffirming, it tells you, okay, not only do I have a future in this business, but in the long term, but in the short term, I know I can hang with the big boys and girls.
Yeah, it was a vote of confidence that they even let me do the series. Mm-hmm. And then to get nominated really reassured me that I could do this. And it was sort of the beginning of what became a very long career. And it was a thrilling beginning.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. So transitioning from writing to reporting. And it's funny that you mentioned the old typewriters, because I could watch a Law and Order episode from the 90s, and there's Jerry Orbach at his desk with the typewriter. I'm thinking to myself, how things have changed in the last 30 years.
Well, they used to smoke in the newsrooms too. You'd see all these people at their typewriters with a cigarette out of their mouth.
And that's another thing that if you go back to a newsroom 30, 40 years ago, I've heard that was a common sight as well. But writing is a gift. And I remember hearing this from Amanda Farinacci when she was on some time ago, the FDNY Communications Commissioner, formerly of New York One, where she said, respect the power of the written word. And just as important as communicating it verbally on camera as a reporter is writing it in the first place. We respect that with our newspaper writers. And it's important now where, in addition to these stories airing, they're also typed up on these different news channels' websites. So in terms of writing, getting all the details correct, even down to the enunciations, I'm sure you liked it to begin with, but tell me about the appreciation you gained for that part of news broadcasting, especially when you're on deadline and you really got to write these succinctly, concisely, and factually.
Well, it was really on-the-job training, because when I went to Queens College, there was no television journalism program at that time. That has changed now. I took one class in newspaper writing, which was helpful way down the line when I started writing for digital. When I had to write for the internet and our website at Pix 11, that newspaper class helped me a lot, because I know that some people who are just used to writing for television, they might have struggled trying to write the other way, which is a different form of writing. So I had to learn how to write for television, and the immediacy of that, make it sound like it's happening now. You're not lying about it, but there's just an immediacy that you want to give the viewers. So that was something that I had to learn. But because I thought that I was pretty good at creative writing, I did make the transition well into television.
And we saw that for sure. And it was kind of, trial by fire, because think about it, during the 80s, crime is through the roof in the city. And we get two crises in one. We get the crack era, which is exploding not just in New York City, but nationally, as we saw, and the AIDS crisis of the latter half of the 1980s as well, which we also saw explode nationally for that matter, too. So just being in the city during that time where it was really gritty, raw, there seemed to be something happening every night, I should say. That is really throwing a reporter to the deep end of the pool. So tell me about just learning on the fly, being out in the field, and some of the stories that stick out in that early part of your career.
Well, actually, with the AIDS crisis, it was sort of in the early 80s, maybe around 82, 83, that I read this article in the Village Voice. And I think it talked about 14 men that had developed sores, and I think most of them had died. And it was this immune disease that no one understood, that your immune system could not fight off anything. And they were dying of unusual diseases, a certain type of pneumonia that wasn't seen frequently. So I had mentioned to a boss at Pix 11 back then, I think we should do something with this. And he was hesitant at first. He didn't know how it would impact the general public. I said, I really think we should do this. And we did a 3-part series that, once again, I was not on camera. The anchor man did the narration, but it was called AIDS Without Answers. And it was one of the first television series on local television in New York about AIDS. I know that around the same time, there was another writer that I used to work with at Channel 2, Sydney Stern. She did a series, but we were like probably the early series on AIDS in New York, and look at what it turned into. And, then in the mid 80s, when I started reporting, when I got that chance on the weekends, and then that evolved into full time, I was doing a lot on the crack cocaine epidemic. And I quickly learned that making contacts in the police department would serve me well, because so much of what the reporting was involved crime. So I did start making contacts in the police department. And part of what the crack epidemic led to was one of the biggest stories that I ever covered, which was the assassination of police officer Edward Byrne in Jamaica, Queens. And he'd only been on the job 6 months. This was 5 days after he turned 22 years old. You just mentioned that you're 24, which is astounding to me. I mean, you're so mature in terms of how you do your questioning. You're doing an excellent job. But he was 22. And that involved a crack gang that was getting mad at the police, trying to enforce certain laws in South Jamaica. And one of the guys that was an enforcer got put into jail. And he put out the word, they take one of us, we take one of them. And when that happened, that just caused an explosion of people in the city saying we have to do something, especially within the police department and City Hall. And within a week, they had caught 4 guys that they said were involved in the assassination.
And that story, and most of you in the audience know it. I believe Eddie was a cop in the 103 out in Queens, if I remember that story correctly.
Yes.
This was during a time, for those of you who may be younger and not know the history of policing in New York City during the 80s, where cops were getting killed at a disturbingly high frequency in the city. There was a lot of line of duty deaths for different reasons. Many of these officers were shot. And this was, of course, back then where there was not just one police department. There were 3. There was a transit police. There was a housing police at the time, separate from the NYPD. You had a lot of officers from those agencies getting seriously injured and killed in line of duty. But what made this brutal was, like the cowards they were, they just walked up to the squad car. He never saw it coming, never had a chance to reach for his gun. He was ambushed and executed simply because of the uniform that he wore.
Well, one guy was at the passenger side, and he was distracting the officer. And then another guy came up from behind and just like at super close range, just shot multiple times. Mm-hmm. And then the videos, there were statements made, at least 3, I believe, that were made on video. And when those videos were released, they were astounding. I mean, the way these guys were describing what went down.
Yeah. Any killing of a police officer is disturbing, but that one ranks amongst the most disturbing ones I've
I think there were 10,000 officers from around the country that went to his funeral on Long Island. That's where he lived. That's where his family lived. And I remember the helicopter shot showing the 10,000 or so officers. I mean, it was an incredible piece of footage to see.
Mm-hmm. President Bush 41, I believe he had his badge at one point.
Yes,
too.
Yes. When he was running for office, the family gave him the shield, and he kept it in the Oval Office, I was told.
Yep. I remember hearing that as well. 5-0 in the chat brings up a question. Later that year, we had another very tragic incident where on the same day in two separate incidents, police officers Chris Hoban and Michael Busick were murdered. They were both shot and killed in separate incidents in the city. It's one of the very few times it's ever happened in New York history. You covered that, I believe.
They were two different events, but it was the same night. It seemed like it was within an hour of each other. Mm-hmm. I will tell you what stands out to me about that time. I covered their funeral, and I say funeral singular. They were buried from the same church, and the church had two staircases going up to the main entrance. And you saw the two coffins covered with the NYPD flag meeting at the top of the staircase and then going into the church. Something I'll always remember.
Yeah, that was, again, another tragic moment, and a lot of them for the NYPD during the 80s. And there was also, at this time, you're with WCBS. So let's go back a second to 1986 and making that switch. You'd gotten pretty comfortable at PIX. Of course, you'd return later. But, you know, there's always opportunities when you can, and you don't want to miss them. You want to take them if they're available, even if it's bittersweet to do so. So what was it that made you make the switch from PIX to WCBS in 86?
Well, you know, I wasn't looking for a new job. The thing was that I was not under contract. I was a staff reporter making a staff rate, and I was going about my life. And I just got word from people that I used to work with at CBS that they were looking to hire young talent, cheap talent, that they wouldn't have to pay that much, that, you know, came from New York and would be go-getters. I was not seeking the job. And as a matter of fact, I met the news director at a deli on one of my days off. And, you know, he saw that I was covering another time in the city history when the NYPD had a little bit of a crisis. Ben Ward was the police commissioner at that time, and he wanted to do rotating shifts because of a corruption scandal that happened among the police. There was the Buddy Boy scandal in the 77th precinct. Some of the guys were accused of stealing from drug dealers or working with drug dealers, tipping them off before police raids. That was a huge scandal. I think there were 13 officers or so that were arrested, and one of them unfortunately committed suicide the day of his, or the night before his arrest. So that was a big story, and they were going to change shifts so that no group of officers got comfortable with each other, especially on the overnight. And so I had footage of my coverage of that, and I challenged the police commissioner and the mayor about things that were going on. So after I had that interview with Channel 2, I didn't chase Channel 2. I didn't call back and say, oh, do you want me? I went about my business at Pix 11. And the one thing I learned at that time, when Channel 2 made the offer to me, I remember I asked my brother for advice, and he said, of course you have to take it. But what I didn't do, and it was because I was so green, I should have gone to my news director at Pix 11, and at the time that was John Corporon. I should have said, listen, I have this offer, and what do you think? But instead, my brother and others said, of course you have to take this job offer, and I took it. And I remember John Corporon, the news director, was very upset at first. And I was so used to seeing people leave Pix 11. It was like a revolving door because a lot of people learned so much there. And then some of them would go off to other states to be reporters because they wanted to do that. So I was surprised at how he reacted. But then within 2 weeks when I left, he had a big cake for me and he had champagne. And John Corporon, 7 years later, is the one that wooed me back, you know, with some promises of being able to do anchoring, which I sought to do, and also to work on special projects, which I ultimately was able to do.
And we'll get to that, of course, later on when you returned in 1993. There were some major trials during this time period that you covered as well. And we'll start with Jill Steinberg, and I'll lay the context for the audience. Now, this one I didn't know about, being a big Law and Order fan. It wasn't until I saw an episode from season 1 that's based off this that I saw the extent of what this was based on. And it's truly horrific. Someone who, on the outside, if you didn't know him any better, appeared to be an affluent guy, appeared to be someone who was well adjusted within society. I believe he was a lawyer, if I'm not mistaken, or involved.
Yes, he was a defense attorney, and he lived in Greenwich Village in a landmark brownstone house. I think Mark Twain, the author, once lived there. So, and he was living with a woman that used to be a publisher for Random House.
And at the same time, not only was he abusing her, he was also abusing their young daughter. And this was when they found out the extent of the abuse. It was just truly horrifying. And this was something that shocked the city because it didn't come from, quote unquote, the usual suspect. So covering that trial as you did, and especially, I know you're a mother. I don't know if you were a mother at that time, but anybody that has a love for children, rather that they're children of their own or nieces or nephews, was understandably horrified by this. What was that like to cover such a, for lack of a better way to word it, excuse my French, a scumbag like him?
Well, first of all, when Joel Steinberg was first arrested, Hedda Nussbaum, his partner, was also arrested. They were both charged with murder in the child abuse killing of Lisa, who was only 6 years old, and whom it turned out they had never legally adopted. Lisa's mother had gone to Joel Steinberg thinking he would find the little girl a nice home. Didn't turn out that way. He kept the child. And apparently there was a lot of drug abuse within the household. Hedda Nussbaum, when she was arrested, looked like she had been pummeled. She had a flattened nose, bruises all over her body, which were cataloged on video. And in fact, the detectives were using yardsticks to measure bruises on different parts of her body. When the trial started about a year later, I was told by my bosses at Channel 2 they wanted me to cover it every day. And we had a noon broadcast, we had a 5, we had a 6. At that time, we were one of the only stations that had a noon broadcast after The Price is Right. So noontime used to get very good news ratings. So it was stressful to have to be there early in the morning, get enough testimony and produce a piece that could be on at noon and would be a viable piece. I'd have to feed back the footage and my narration, and a writer would have to assemble it back at the station. That's how it was back then. And I remember there'd be deadlines, like they released the video of Hedda Nussbaum's injuries pretty early in the case. I think they released the video at 4:30 and I had to be the lead at 5. So that was stressful. And then the photos of Lisa's injuries, which were from the medical examiner's office. My recollection is these photos went on the air back then. Now, this was almost 40 years ago. And I don't know if they would show the photos now, but we did have photos on the air of some of Lisa's bruises. One thing that happened during that trial was I had one of the biggest stories ever in my career, and it did not involve an interview. Someone associated with the case liked my reporting and had access to the files of what Hedda Nussbaum was going to testify about as the star witness, because she made a deal with the prosecutors to testify against her partner, Joel Steinberg. And Channel 2 made a decision. It was going to broadcast Hedda Nussbaum's testimony live, wall-to-wall coverage, and forget about the soap operas that were on in the afternoon. A couple of weeks before Hedda Nussbaum testified, I got access to the records of what she was going to say happened in the apartment that night. And so I did, I think, a 5-minute piece. And in local news, you don't normally do 5-minute pieces. But I had to create all these graphics with all the information. And the next day, my stories, the information in the story made it to the cover of the Daily News and the New York Post. And the general manager came down and shook my hand because this was a big deal to have our story quoted on the major tabloid papers of the city. And then 2 weeks later, when she took the stand, we did the wall-to-wall coverage. And she was on the stand 9 days. That's a long time. And what happened was the ratings tripled when she was on over the soap opera ratings. And I often say, I think that the Hedda Nussbaum testimony was the precursor to Court TV. Court TV wasn't on at that time. And this was when cameras were allowed in the courtroom. So a lot of stations were covering trials because you could get a camera in the courtroom and people were riveted.
Understandably so, given the complex nature of the case. And ultimately, he was convicted. He was also disbarred, which, go figure, that's a given.
But interesting, you should note that he was not convicted of murder. He was convicted of manslaughter in the first degree, which at that time carried a sentence of 8.5 to 25 years. And I think some of the jurors acknowledged it was kind of a compromise verdict because some of them were upset that Hedda Nussbaum was not held criminally liable. I mean, she was a battered woman. She was a battered woman.
That's for sure.
And so interestingly enough, he was not convicted of murder. And I was there, I think it was 17 years later, when he got out from an upstate prison. I think it was Elmira, New York, and every station in New York was there, as well as the national news. And we were like in these thick weeds waiting for him to come out in the morning. And it was a little bizarre because the lawyer that was representing him brought him home in a white limousine. And I had a tip of where he would be brought to. It was a halfway house in Harlem. So my producer, Noreen Lark, she and her cameraman chased this entourage for 4.5 hours back to New York City and got the footage of when he was handed over to the people from the halfway house.
And that's, again, by that point, so much had changed, so much had happened. But it's sobering. I'm like, here was a girl that, again, and this is a different story for a different day. She only lived 6 years, and yet he only gets out in 17, So it goes to show it, again, compromised verdict, as you said, and just a very sad case overall. Now, that transitions us into John Gotti. And here's an individual who was polarizing from the standpoint that, listen, obviously we know stone cold gangster, murderer, but such a gregarious personality, such an outgoing personality, such a flair, if you will, that, he was almost as someone that grew up watching wrestling as I did. I call him a real life version of Ric Flair. He was a character that hit the streets in real life, and his rise to power was through bloodshed. We all know what he did in December of 1985, ordered the hit on Paul Castellano, had Paul Castellano and his driver and underboss, Tommy Bellotti, executed outside Sparks Steakhouse. And that was his ascent to being boss ultimately. Now, he'd been the Teflon Don. He'd gotten off on quite a number of charges, had a great team of lawyers. Finally, in the early 90s, his luck ran out. So covering that trial, which I believe was the trial that finally did him in for all his horrific crimes that he tried to mask with that outgoing personality, what was it like being, for lack of a better way to word it, and unfortunately this is the case, covering one of the more iconic figures, for better or worse, in the last 50 years in New York City's history?
Well, it's something that will always stay with me. And they did interview me, the producers working for Netflix, for the 3-part series Get Gotti. But I should mention that when I was still at Channel 11 the first time as a young reporter, I guess it was late 1986 or 85, I covered the hit on Paul Castellano because I was only 4 blocks away from Sparks Steakhouse. So I was sent over there, and I was so green. I see 2 bodies under a tarp, one on either side of the black car that Castellano was being driven in. And it was probably one of my first encounters with big FBI agents, like the special agent in charge in New York. And so I always remember interviewing them. Rudy Giuliani, who was then the U.S. attorney for the Southern District, was supposed to hold the commission trial, which was hoping to take down the 5 godfathers of each of the 5 families in New York. And now Castellano was gone. So I went to his press conference that night. So there I was, Channel 11, covering the hit. And then about 7 years later, I'm covering the trial of the century involving the Godfather, John Gotti, in federal court in Brooklyn. And no cameras were allowed inside the courtroom because that's never been the case, that, you have a camera in federal court. So we had to really bring this case to life for the viewers. And we relied on a lot of the video surveillance that was provided by the government in evidence. So we had what we called the walk talks, John Gotti outside his club on Mulberry Street, talking to the different players in the Gambino crime family. But what I'll always remember, the biggest witness of that trial was Sammy Bull Gravano, his former underboss, who was supposed to go on trial with him. And then when he heard some of these audio tapes where Gotti was making, negative comments about Sammy and Sammy being greedy to get more business, that he became enraged. I guess he also knew that these tapes would not be good for him. And he reached out and asked to speak to the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office, and they made a deal. He became the star witness and admitted to 19 or 20 murders during his career. But the jury believed him, and he helped get John Gotti and Frank Locascio convicted.
Gotti almost acted as if he was an emperor, because there's always a story that I laugh whenever I hear it, but Gravano himself told it, which is, I guess one day they were discussing business, and John, seriously, not joking around, said, "I wonder how this message is going to look for our people," meaning the public. And Sammy looks at him and says, "Our people? John, we're gangsters. What are you talking about?" But such was his power at the time, and such was his invincibility up until that point, that, yeah, he did feel like he was a ruler. He did feel like he was more powerful than any mayor or any senator or any governor, because for a time, unfortunately, he could do just about anything until in the early 90s, as we just discussed, his luck ran out.
Well, he made the cover of Time magazine, and he went to the best discos and restaurants,
Yeah.
and he was a good-looking man,
Mhm.
and he was very dashing, and that's why they called him the Dapper Don.
Yeah. And, if you look at his neighborhood was one of the safest in New York City when he lived there at the peak of his powers, because you didn't want to commit any crimes when you knew who was around. So that's something that people always who live in that part of Queens would say. Nothing ever happened. That neighborhood was safe when John Gotti was around. He ended up, of course, serving a life sentence until he died, I believe, of cancer in 2002. And he died pretty young. He was only 61 or 62
Yeah,
when he
early
died.
60s. Yeah, he was in prison about 10 years when he died.
Yeah, I think he died up in Missouri, if I remember correctly. Now, before I move on to the first attack on the Trade Center in 1993, because this was the beginning of the war on terror here in the States, 1990, when Meyer Kahane was shot dead by al-Sayed Nosir, did you cover that?
A little bit of it. I remember the footage. We rely a lot on the stringers when we don't have our own footage. And I remember that shot of the stretcher. I think he was in a hotel when he was shot. And I just always remember that. And I did do a little bit about his case. And I could sort of put that into context when the 93 truck bombing happened in the World Trade Center, which, a lot of people may not remember because they weren't born yet. But that really set the stage for what happened on 9/11, 2001.
Now, for those of you that are watching the show tonight for the first time, we have a mini-series on this program called Tales from the Boom Room, which profiles retired members of the NYPD arson, explosion, and bomb squad. And Detective Don Sadawi, who discovered the critical piece of evidence in that case, which was the VIN number used in the truck that ultimately the bomb was stored in, was featured on this program discussing that at length. So go after this interview tonight if you can and check out that three-parter I did with Don a number of years ago. Now, the footage that is available on YouTube for those of you that want to see it, you're right there, I believe, in the garage or pretty close to the impact zone where this bomb had gone off. Now, the goal was, for those that may not know, they were going to park the truck very close to one of the pillars of the North Tower in the parking garage below the tower itself. And had they succeeded in placing the truck properly, what that would have done, Ramzi Youssef's bomb that is, was destabilize the balance of the tower so much it would tilt into the South Tower and send both towers toppling over into the city, which, if you look at the casualties on 9/11, which were bad enough, this would have dwarfed that had they succeeded with what they wanted to do in 1993. And again, talk about trials, talk about something that went on for quite a number of years even. It didn't really end until Youssef himself was sentenced in 1998. We'll start with that day itself. Tell me about getting down to the scene and seeing the devastation up close.
Well, I just wrote about it this past week on the September 11th anniversary. It's ironic that we're talking about 93 because a lot of what I wrote about concerned 1993. So I was at the PBA office on Fulton Street. I had just done an interview around 12 noon. And we spoke to the president. At the time, I think it was Phil Caruso. And we had just left. And as we're leaving, my cameraman and I from CBS, we're hearing this incessant blare of sirens. And we're hearing ambulances. And we're like, oh, something crazy is going on. So I immediately called the news desk. And we spoke to the researcher, Wanda Provenzano, who is still at Channel 2 to this day. And she said, oh, something happened at the Trade Center. And I'm not sure if she said that a bomb went off. We weren't quite sure. She just said, get to the hospital. It's only maybe 2 blocks from where you are. And that was Beekman Downtown Hospital, which has a new name now. And when we got there, the cameraman immediately threw up the microwave mast on our truck. And I never saw, to this day, that many ambulances in my life. They just kept coming one after another. Some people were being brought off on stretchers. Some people were hobbling, with soot all over their faces, into the emergency room, and we were grabbing what we could in terms of interviews. But fairly early on, I got the best interview of that day, and that was with a man named Vito DeLeo. And he had crawled out of the rubble. He was only 150 feet away from the parking garage on the B2 level. He was near his desk having lunch, and he had said that the desk kind of rose up when the bomb went off and then it plopped down and he was under the desk. And that probably saved him because the ceiling came down, all this other stuff, debris came raining down, and he crawled out of the rubble. And I'd say at least 4 or 5 of the victims were in the lunchroom next to him, and they worked for the Port Authority. One of them was Monica Rodriguez Smith. She was almost near her due date. She was carrying her unborn son. So they both perished. and some of her coworkers, Mr. Knapp, Mr. Kirkpatrick, and William Macco. And then there was a gentleman who had just parked his car in the garage, John DiGiovanni, who was killed. So you have 6 people, but 7 if you count the unborn child. And Vito got out, and he was very concerned about his coworkers, and he just gave this vivid description of what happened. And Jim Jensen was the anchorman at the time at Channel 2, and just made it clear he wanted us to keep Vito on the air because he was just giving us such good details of what happened. He was so close to it.
And sadly, Vito
There's
was
a
killed.
follow-up. Vito was killed. Yes, on 9/11.
Yeah, he was there again 8 years later. And Bill Ryan in the chat, who had a hand in investigating that bombing as a member of the arson explosion squad, knew Vito very well.
And when you mention that, I'm not sure which squad it was. And even if I did know, I probably wouldn't say. But after working like 12 hours that day until after the 11 o'clock news that night, the bosses said, can you stay overnight and go over to the Trade Center? We need coverage overnight. So I went there, and that's a crime scene. And fairly soon, there were some guys from one of the police agencies that asked me if I wanted a jumpsuit, and they let me go inside. I didn't have a camera crew. I wasn't allowed to bring the camera crew inside, but I could visually see. It was remarkable. I mean, the hole that was blown extended 6 stories high, and it was really wide, and you could see all the charred vehicles that had been destroyed or burned very badly.
And worth noting, New York City firefighter was critically injured during this operation too. A story that's also been told in this program. Kevin Shea, Garrett Lindgren here in the chat. He's a retired firefighter out of the Bronx, was Rescue 3. Kevin Shea of Rescue 1, who thankfully survived that day, was searching for survivors initially. And when this bomb went off, it was very acrid, dark smoke. You couldn't see the hand in front of your face. Kevin went falling down, I believe, I don't know how many stories, but miraculously lived to tell a tale about it. He was partnered up that day with firefighter Gary Geidel, who sadly 8 years later responded again with Rescue 1, and that time would not survive. But just a lot of stories from that day, and what was really one of the early warning shots, along with several others during that decade, with the war on terror that rings true, sadly, all these years later, with both that attack and what would happen 8 years later. So around this time is when you go back. You were, as you said earlier, you would move back to PIX, which would be the longest stint that you would have at any news agency. Of course, part 2 would last you 31 years. So going back, a lot had changed in those 7 years. The news agency is always, or news business as a whole, is always shifting forward. But it had to feel like, nevertheless, being right at home again. A lot of the same people I'm sure you worked with 7 years prior, for the most part, were still there. So what was it like to go back?
I mean, a lot of them were still there, and there were some new faces as well. I think, when I first went back, some of the people were like, oh, she's coming from Channel 2. It was an O&O, a network affiliate. And so I don't know if some of them thought that I would be too big for my britches. I certainly didn't approach it that way. I went back because I was told I would get a lot of opportunities that might have been hard for me to get at CBS 2. I wanted to get some anchoring experience. I also wanted to work on stories that were longer than 2 or 3 minutes. I didn't want to always have to be live because I did so much live coverage in those 7 years. It could have burned me out because there was when you're a breaking news reporter and you're live all the time, I didn't spend that much time in the newsroom. I mean, I was on the road most of the time, and I just wanted a chance to show I could do other things. So Karen Scott was the executive producer at Pix 11 in 93. And she's the one who really wooed me over heavily because she used to be at Channel 4. So we met when we were competitors. She did a show when the John Gotti verdict happened. And I think one of the producers that was on the field kind of stole an interview that I was hoping to get. So we were friendly rivals. We were friendly, more than friendly. We were friends. And she wanted to give me a chance to do other things. So she brought me to Pix 11. And pretty soon I was covering the Mullen Commission. That was something set up by, I think, Mayor David Dinkins before Rudy Giuliani came into office. And there was corruption in the police department involving show of force, and also drug dealing, all that kind of stuff. In some ways, it was similar to what had happened with the Buddy Boys in the 77th precinct. So they had these big hearings in Midtown. And one of the guys that testified was this guy, Michael Dowd, from the 7-7 precinct. He was later featured in, I believe, that documentary that was done called the 7-5.
Yeah.
And his story was pretty wild. So I covered his testimony and other testimony during that time of the Mullen Commission. And that was just the beginning of the 30 years at PICS.
Yeah, that's a name that makes my skin crawl for a variety of reasons. Talk about, yeah, it's not exactly a very upstanding individual for those of you familiar with his story, and most of you in the chat are. No need to go into it further. And that was a tough time for the police department because there was him and all his escapades, which is putting it mildly, believe me. And then there was also the Dirty 30 scandal too, which was a separate incident in Harlem, which enveloped the 30th precinct.
Yeah, I covered some of that. I mean, I covered a lot more with the Mullen Commission. The 30-30, I always remember Police Commissioner Bratton was in office at the time, and he went into the precinct and he threw the shields of the offending officers into the garbage can.
Yep. And that was one of the iconic moments early on in his first stint as NYPD commissioner, because he said at the time, no officer will ever have to wear a disgraced shield. That's the tone for what was a major turnaround in the mid-90s for New York City, and by extension, of course, the NYPD. Now, you have the real story. For those of you familiar with the film, there is the film Schindler's List, an iconic film in its own right. You covered the real story behind that. So for those not familiar with what that real story is, tell us, please.
Well, this was my first opportunity to work on a half-hour special. And that was part of the reason I went back to PICS. And I was really thrilled that I got this opportunity. When Schindler's List came out, we became aware that there were people who had survived the Schindler work camps who survived because they were given jobs there. The youngest survivor was only about 5, and he was featured in the film. You know, an actor played the role, but featured hiding in a barrel near the Schindler work camps when the Nazis came around. So the general manager at the time, Michael Eigner, got access to a documentary that was done about Schindler, the real Schindler. And it was an hour and a half long, this documentary. And we needed to fill 2 hours because we used to have a movie on between 8 and 10, and then the 10 o'clock news would come on. So Karen Scott asked me to be involved in producing the half-hour special, along with Ellen Marks, who was another reporter, producer working at the station at the time. And we met that little kid who was now an adult, middle-aged or older. And he ran a very successful photography business. He used to do commercial photography, you know, for ads in magazines and on television. So meeting him was spectacular. And he got very emotional recalling what he went through, you know, the anxiety, worrying that you were going to be killed at any moment. We met a couple that was living in New Jersey that had survived the camps. I think Oskar Schindler, who was this industrialist who moved to Warsaw in Poland when the Nazis started taking over, you know, he took pity on over 1,100 people that were working in his camp, or at his factory, I should say. And they survived as a result of him not giving them up.
Which is sobering to think about, especially
and Steven Spielberg won, you know, Best Director for putting that movie together so beautifully, and it won Best Picture. It was a spectacular film.
Yes, Schindler's
List. We got to meet Steven Spielberg, and Liam Neeson played Oskar Schindler. So there was an event in New York when we got lucky. We were working on this 30-minute special, and Spielberg and Liam Neeson happened to be in New York, and we spoke to both of them. So that was a nice addition to have, along with the real people behind the movie.
Yeah, it blended together beautifully. And again, a great film in its own right. Cannot recommend it enough. One of the best films, not just of the 90s, but one of the best films ever made by that, for that matter, by, as you mentioned, Mr. Spielberg. Now, moving ahead a couple of years later, 1996, TWA Flight 800. This was a story that comes at a unique time. A lot of people, understandably, jumped to the conclusion early on that it may have been terrorism. We just had the 93 bombing. Ramzi Youssef had been caught by this time, and he was on trial for the Bajinka plot, in addition to the Trade Center bombing, which was a plot to blow up various airliners across international borders, but over the water, to cause mass death and destruction there. We'd also had the Oklahoma City bombing the year prior in 1995. So when people hear of a plane going down mysteriously and exploding midair, that was the first thought they had. Regardless of the cause, a very tragic incident right in the Mauritius area of Long Island. So tell me about covering that and just the heartbreaking amount of stories on that plane alone. 217 people, I believe, were killed.
Yeah, I think with the crew, it might have been over 230. It was horrific. I was one of the people that thought it was terrorism. You know, after the 93 World Trade Center bombing, a few months later, the FBI arrested the Egyptian blind sheikh and other co-conspirators, and they were plotting to blow up New York City tunnels, the United Nations, other landmarks. So, you know, we knew New York City was the number one target. And this flight had left from John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York, and it was going overseas to Paris. So there was that immediate thought that it was likely terrorism. But, you know, the investigation went on, and there were theories that maybe a missile friendly fire, you know, during testing out in the Atlantic or some other body of water had hit the plane. That was one of the theories. There were people who had reported seeing some flash of light going up into the sky and hitting the plane, the jet. We ended up doing a special on the 5th anniversary. And by that time, the FBI had started believing that it was the center fuel tank of this jet that had overheated because the plane was on the tarmac, delayed for a very long time on a hot night, and that the overheating had caused this explosion. So officially, I believe the authorities are saying it was the center fuel tank, but there have been documentaries done since, you know, that beg to differ.
Yeah. Yep, for sure. As you were going to say, I'm sorry.
No, during the course of covering that case, especially as we approached the 5th anniversary, I was able to get footage from the Department of Defense that showed the Navy divers underneath at the wreckage and seeing their boots, you know, moving in the water and then going through all the areas of the jet before it was all brought up. That was, you know, something that will always stay with me. And then, you know, they used side scan sonar to try to isolate parts of the jet. And then they pretty much put it back together, almost every piece, at this hangar out in Calverton, Long Island. So that's a memory that stays with me. You know, but there were families killed, little children. It was terrible.
Yeah. And that display, or when they reconfigured the jet, I should say, it wasn't a display. It's a poor way to word it. Was in Calverton for, I believe, 25 years. It was up there for a while. I believe the intent of that was for FBI agents coming into the field, newer agents, to study it and understand the concept of it for future investigations they may encounter. So that display was there, or not display, but that reconfiguration, once again, was there for quite a number of years, if not decades. And again, that was something that never sat right with those that investigated it. Neither from the fire department, neither from the NYPD bomb squad, which assisted with the investigation. The final report did not come out on that incident until the summer of 2000. So about 4 years after the initial tragedy itself. This investigation went on for quite some time. It wasn't until 2000 where that final report came out, which is available in its entirety online for those of you interested in seeing it. You had a tragic deja vu in 1997 covering the death of Princess Diana. You had a similar story years earlier. And while that's interesting in and of itself, and I don't want to diminish that, 1999, when JFK Jr.'s plane goes down over Martha's Vineyard during that summer weekend, here was a guy that was really the prince of New York City. And he was one of the last major celebrities to be followed around, like Princess Diana was, in the age before cell phones and social media and everything that we have now. And him and Carolyn Bessette, and there's a great article that came out on the first anniversary of their deaths by People magazine. It's called To Have and to Hold. And it came out in July of 2000. Really painted them, and they were, this was an accurate portrayal, the first couple of America. You know, and here was a guy who was a Renaissance man. He was a news presenter on MTV. He had his own magazine for a while, George Magazine, which was founded in the mid-90s. There was nothing he really couldn't do. It helped. He was a handsome guy on top of that. Everyone seemed to love this guy. He was an affable guy. And here he is, dying so young, along with his wife and his sister-in-law that weekend. So when you learned that first his plane was missing, and it was obvious that, unfortunately, we would not get a positive outcome to this, what was that like to cover?
No, it was very upsetting because I actually did meet him once. There was an event involving George Magazine at a fancy shirt shop on 57th Street. I think it's Turnbull and Asser. And I went there, and I guess I was going to ask him a brief question on, it was probably for a feature story. And I just remember he was very gracious, very kind. And when I said my name, he said, "Oh, Mary Murphy, that's a nice Irish name." He was sweet. I didn't know him that well. I remember how he got so much publicity when he went to work at the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, and people were following him every time he took the bar exam. That became a big news story. Will he pass it this time? And he finally did pass it. And I'm told he was a really nice coworker, colleague in the DA's office. And then, of course, he moved on and he became the publisher of this magazine. And it was just tragic because we remembered him as a little boy. I think he was 3 years old when his father was assassinated in 1963. And to have him die this way was just horrific. He took flying lessons. And on that particular night, I don't think he had the person with him that would sometimes fly with him when he would fly at night. And as he got close to Martha's Vineyard, which was where he was dropping off maybe his sister-in-law. I know that there was going to be a Kennedy family wedding that weekend.
Yep.
But, he lost perspective. There's a name for it. The spatial
disorientation.
Yeah, he was disoriented. And then the plane tragically went into some kind of a spiral. So that was terrible. And it happened on a Friday evening. And then I was the weekend anchor at the time. So, of course, we know this would dominate the headlines for the weekend and the week beyond. And Marvin Scott, I believe, and Jim Watkins were sent up to Massachusetts to cover the search. And I believe that ultimately when the wreckage was found, that John F. Kennedy Jr. and his wife and his sister, I don't know if they were all buried at sea, but I know that he was buried at sea.
Yeah, and he was only, again, 38 years old at the time. And Time magazine waited a few days, and I believe they decided sometime over the weekend when it became apparent that this was not going to have a positive outcome. There would be no survival here. It was a very simple cover, but very poignant. A picture of him looking dapper, looking as handsome as he always did. Simply said, John F. Kennedy Jr., 1960 to 1999. And I think Ted Kennedy, and this is also a line that hits particularly hard, said in the eulogy for his nephew, John had every gift, and I quote, John had every gift but length of years.
Yes.
Yeah. He squeezed a lot.
The funeral, the memorial service was held in Manhattan.
Yes. I do remember reading about that. Another guy that very talented and lost way too soon. Before I touch on September 11th, 2001, of which the 23rd anniversary just passed, covering the NYPD in the mid-90s was a very interesting time. Bratton had left in 1996. I had the good fortune to know Howard Safer and feature him on this program. I considered him a friend, and I miss him very much. He was really, although he was not as outgoing as Bratton was, Bratton has more of an outgoing personality. He knew what he was doing. He was an excellent fire commissioner, and even though he had that hard personality, he got the job done quite well as police commissioner as well. Crime continued to fall under him. Before Bernie Carrick came in, though, those 4 years being around Commissioner Safer and his team, what was he like to cover? Because I feel like he's often a guy, and this changed once he retired, who was very misunderstood.
Yeah, I mean, he did seem a little stiff, but I know he also had experience in the U.S. Marshal Service as well. So he had done that. He had been the fire commissioner. He was friends with the mayor. And Rudy Giuliani, I don't think, was very happy with the publicity that Bill Bratton was getting. And so Bill Bratton, the first time in the mid-90s, I think, was on the job for 2 years before he resigned. Bill Bratton made the cover of Time magazine. I don't think Mayor Giuliani was happy about that. So Howard Safer would not present any kind of a publicity threat to Rudy Giuliani, and they were friends. And as you said, he had experience in multiple agencies, both law enforcement and the fire department. So, I remember covering him, but I have memories of some of the other commissioners more. And in fact, in the late 90s, when Bernie Carrick became the corrections commissioner, he allowed me to come into Rikers because, he was telling us that he'd had some success with his programs that were initiated in reducing violence among the inmates. And I remember being in there among the inmates and Bernie Carrick, and it was an interesting experience.
Oh, for sure. Bernie Carrick, and a lot of people care for him. Some people do not care for him. That's a different story for a different day. Say what you will about him on a personal level. During his time in corrections, and it's a sense interesting because he was previously Mayor Giuliani's driver when he was a narcotics detective and an undercover one for a while at that. he did drive crime down in the jails. Incidents did drop significantly under him, to give him credit where it's due. And in the summer of 2000, here's a former third grade detective coming out of nowhere. And a lot of people thought Joe Dunn would be the next police commissioner, who Safer had recommended when he was going out the door. In comes Bernie Carrick instead. And he had it for a year. He wasn't commissioner very long, but he's always going to be a name that, unlike other commissioners who served for a short amount of time, is going to be remembered because he was at the helm of the NYPD during the events of 9/11. So everyone has a story about that day that's old enough to recall it. Your September 11th, 2001, where were you when you found out about what was going on?
I know it was a Tuesday, and I had actually taken off that week because my son was 5 years old and he was starting kindergarten that week. So Monday was the first day, and I brought him to kindergarten and I picked him up. And then Tuesday came and I dropped him off, and my husband and I went to vote because it was the day of the mayoral primary. And my hair was soaking wet. I had washed my hair and was in casual clothes. And as I was coming back from voting in Queens, my mother called me and she said, "Did you see what happened with the World Trade Center?" And I thought she said the train in the World Trade Center. And I said, "Mom, the train?" She said, "No, the plane. A plane hit the tower." So I was 2 blocks from home and I ran into the house. I turned on Pix 11 and there was a static shot of the first tower burning. And I said, "Oh my God," and I said, "I have to go into work." I knew. And before I had my jacket on, my professional blazer, the second tower was hit. So I immediately knew then it was terrorism. The first tower, I remembered that once there was a plane that hit the Empire State Building and it was an accident, and I wasn't sure the size of this plane that hit the first tower. But once the second tower was hit, I'm like, this is terrorism. So my husband drove me to the number 7 train in Flushing. I went downstairs sat on the train and it wasn't moving. And they said, "You have to leave the platform, leave the station. No trains will be going out of the station." Went upstairs, got on a bus, wanted to go to the 59th Street Bridge to get into Manhattan. And the bus was not going as far as the bridge. I actually hitched a ride, something I had never done in my life, with an old man driving a pickup truck. He took me to the base of the 59th Street Bridge. And, as I'm making my way to the bridge, by this time, the second tower is down. It's like around 10:30 in the morning. And I ran over the 59th Street Bridge, and, hundreds, thousands of people are running the other way to leave Manhattan. And when I got to the other side of the bridge, there was a bus and it was packed with people like sardines. And it took me down to 42nd Street and ran into the newsroom. And I saw the anchor people on the air, and they kept showing shots of the towers, like one of those steady cam pictures. And I think our helicopter was still up in the air with Melinda Murphy, who was the traffic reporter. So she was one of the last helicopters that was still in the air downtown, so they could get a picture there. But I said to the news assignment editor, "Do we have any footage from the scene?" And they pointed to a stack of tapes on the desk. And I'm like, "Well, we got to look at these." And when I went to an edit room, one of the first tapes I looked at, one of our photographers, Mike Barbagallo, was under the second tower when it was hit. He got the footage of the plane hitting the tower and then the debris raining down and people running out of buildings. So I started producing pieces. At first, they were just natural sound. There was no narrative, just to get some of this footage on the air showing how crazy it was down there. And then after doing that for about an hour and a half, they asked me to do some narrative because we had interviews with survivors. And then after a few hours, when Kaidi Tong needed to check on her son, who was a student at Stuyvesant High School, which was right there by the Twin Towers, I eventually was filling in on the set as an anchor. Marvin Scott and I were spotting Kaidi Tong and Jim Watkins when they had to take a break. So I was on the air for hours for the first 5 days, anchoring quite a bit, but also producing pieces. The first night, I would say by about 9:30 at night, we learned that 343 fire department personnel, mostly firefighters, were missing and presumed dead. We knew the chief of department, Peter Gansey, was probably gone. Father Michael Judge was the chaplain. He's the first official casualty of 9/11, listed as casualty 1. So it was just more and more we were learning how catastrophic this was, that we would never see a day like this probably ever again in our city's history.
you knew undoubtedly a lot of the fire department personnel. You'd spent a lot of time around the police department. For the 23 NYPD officers, did you know any of them personally?
Well, my husband was friendly with Joseph Vigiano, who was working in emergency services. His father was a retired fire captain, and Joe's brother was a firefighter, and both of them died. The parents lost their only sons that day. I knew some of the firefighters as well. I had covered Patty Brown, who I think was a captain at this point, and he had done this with some others from the rescue company some years before, when I was still working at Channel 2. They did this dramatic rope rescue from a burning building on 7th Avenue. And it was very daring. And we had put them on the set on Channel 2, Patty Brown. And so I felt really badly when I heard that he had died. And, there was the president of the fire union, his son, Michael Lynch, passed. I knew what Timothy Stackpole, he had survived a fire in the late 90s, and he was burned over, I believe, over 50% of his body, and was out of active duty for over 2 years, just trying to recover, but wanted to go back so badly. And he did go back to full duty, and he was promoted, I think, about 5 days before 9/11. I believe the rank was captain. And so when part of his remains were found, his wife, Tara, that weekend allowed me to interview her. And she said he had I think the fire commissioner had said he had the heart of a lion for going back to work, despite the burns over so much of his body. So I did his story. I did a lot of stories. I did the men of Ladder 103, and it was 103, and half the team had survived, and the other half didn't. So there was so much that went on, and so much heroics, but also so much tragedy. And for a year straight, I covered post 9/11.
That 2001, 2002 for New Yorkers, even into 2003, was a very, very somber.
Well, then, yeah. And then even so, after covering, like, just trying to clear the site and find the people and just get back on our feet as a city, that went on for a year. And they closed down the site. I guess it was May 30th of 2002. And I was down there for that. But then by 2004, 2005, we're starting to hear about health problems. And that's when I met John Field before he started the Feel Good Foundation. He was part of these support groups that these people were having all different health problems. So I would say from 2004 to say 2008, 2009, I'm doing a lot of stories on the health problems associated with people that were working downtown or survived downtown on 9/11.
Some of the earliest first responders that died of 9/11 illness died as early as late 2002, early 2003. It wasn't officially recognized as illnesses related to the Trade Center until a few years later. James Zadroga's father, who we recently tragically lost, was a big part of that. Zadroga himself was an NYPD detective who died of 9/11 cancer back in 2006. And you mentioned Patty Brown earlier. What you're referring to is 1991. He was a lieutenant in Rescue 1 at the time. And this was really uplifting story. Him, Kevin Shea, Bruce Newberry from Rescue 1, and Lieutenant Ray McCormack, at that time a firefighter, later on promoted, rescued 2 individuals trapped in a fire. And Kevin was lowered over the ledge by Bruce, then Lieutenant Brown, and firefighter Newberry, firefighter McCormack, rather, to save those gentlemen. Stackpole was critically injured in a fire at Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn, June of 1998. 2 firefighters were killed in that particular blaze. He survived, came back to duty. And I think that morning, I remember Tom Von Nessen telling me, he actually responded from the medical office when the job came in. Tim Stackpole was in the medical office, put together a team, went into the towers, never came back down. But as you said, part of a line. Just a couple of the stories from that day that definitely stand out. And the last note on it, you mentioned Joe Vigiano. The man was shot 3 times separately in the line of duty. For those of you in the audience that don't know his story, came back to work each time. Shot in 89, shot in 90, I believe 94 as well. Came back to work each time. The reason he wanted to go to the emergency service unit, when they asked him, Dick Wolf did a documentary on him. He's like, it's simple. When I got shot, these were the guys, meaning emergency service, that went out and got the perp that did this to me. He got into emergency service, and he was a heck of an E-man right up until the bitter end. So thank you for mentioning those guys. over the course of one's journalistic career, it's always nice to get those recognitions from your peers and from viewers too. That's important. But the awards matter too, to a healthy extent. And so each time you got recognized for an award, and you got quite a bit of them, as I mentioned in the introduction of you. Tell me about the feeling, because even after all these years, you still want to feel like your work means something. And so to see those awards in actual physical form, it has to serve as its own form of validation in its own right, I imagine.
Yeah, well, I sometimes will remember that I lost 12 times at the Emmy Awards before I was recognized with our team from CBS 2 for the Joel Steinberg verdict. We did team coverage that night, and there were probably at least 7 or 8 reports, and it was very good coverage, and we were recognized for that. And then I did win for covering the John Gotti trial, continuing coverage in 1992. So those were the 2 that I won at CBS 2, but the bulk of the awards came at Pix 11. And I'm very grateful to the various news managers over the years who gave me the opportunity to do stories that mattered, that I could really sink my investigative skills into. And the ones that meant the most to me were when I could make a difference in someone's life. And back in 2013, I started doing these Mary Murphy mysteries, which were unsolved cases or missing persons cases. And one of them was seen a year later online by a woman in Pennsylvania. And she said, that was my daughter. This little girl remembered being 2 years old, and that's about it. She didn't even know her real name, except that she was called Millie. And her mother kind of escaped a violent situation at this house in Brooklyn. And the mother's friend took care of the little girl and adopted her as her own. But this woman, Millie, never knew her birth date. She didn't know her mother's real name. She thought her mother was called Lisa. So this woman in Pennsylvania saw this story a year after I presented it, but it was 38 years since she had seen her daughter. And it resulted in them being reunited, and a DNA test proved they were mother and daughter. It was a spectacular moment to witness, and it's something I'll feel good about the rest of my life.
Oh, it's an uplifting story. And that's the thing, that even for an investigative reporter, do you cover a lot of hard-hitting stories? Yes, but there's also a lot of uplifting moments too. And that's certainly one of them.
Yeah, in 1986, I'm a Queens girl, and the Mets, that was the last World Series that they won. Yeah. So I was able to cover the ticker tape parade. And back then we didn't have trucks and loads of security like we have now. They would ride on the back seat of a convertible. The convertible was open. And so I got to walk up to all the heroes of the 1986 Mets and interview them. So that was a thrill to be able to do that. I covered much later at Pix 11 in 2013, the election of Pope Francis in Vatican City. And Dan Manarino and I were live when the white smoke came out of the Sistine Chapel, the chimney. And we were the only local station that stayed on live, except for New York One. But most of the other reporters there from the locals, they were preempted by the networks. So we were on about an hour and a half doing commentary until the Pope came out on the balcony. So that was really thrilling as a Catholic girl from Queens to witness the crowds in St. Peter's Square being so excited when this new Pope, the first from the Americas, from South America, was elected by his peers.
Being center stage for a lot of these big moments, both nationally and internationally, there has to be a point in time where you pinch yourself and say, like, am I really here right now? Because even if one always is of a positive mentality and always is shooting for the stars, so to speak, there's a lot of work. You have to really put your head down and grind to get there, whatever it is that you're pursuing. But when you actually have those rare moments to stop and take stock in how far you've come, it has to feel not only good, but sobering to realize, A, where hard work gets you, and B, just, again, all the things needed, the hard work, the luck, the skill to get to where you want to be, to get to where you think you can be, and then look and say, holy crap, I'm actually here.
Well, I continue to be grateful for all the history that I witnessed over the course of more than 40 years. I am very lucky that I was able to be part of it and see it firsthand, sort of get a front seat view of history. On the other hand, it is a grind. If you care about your work, if you're a perfectionist, if you want to get it right, it takes a toll. And, you trying to juggle a family with a job like this is very difficult. I mean, when my son was born, I was working unusual hours. I would be home during the day on the weekends and work an evening shift as anchor. I would be off Monday and Tuesday. So I used to tell myself I had 4 days of pretty solid time with him. But then the other 3 days when I was on the street, it was tough because I wouldn't get a camera crew right away all the time. And sometimes I'd be coming home just, an hour before he went to bed. I was lucky that my mother helped a lot. Those 2 days when I would go to work on the street as a reporter, she was there Wednesdays and Thursdays, and I remain grateful for that. And my husband, of course, I had some friends that helped, but it's tough, because you want to be the best mom that you can be. But if you're a journalist in a demanding profession, it's tough to do both really well.
That's a struggle that I think a lot of parents encounter in a field like that. Was there ever a point where you felt, and again, it's balancing act is easier said than done. Was there ever a point where you feel like, okay, I've got it. I've successfully managed to juggle both motherhood, being present for my family, and this job?
I don't think there was ever totally a point when that happened. I know that when my son was 13 or so, that's when I was told I wouldn't be the weekend anchor anymore. So I would go to full time on the streets Monday to Friday. So for that year that he was in 8th grade, when he was 13, I would drop him off at school in the morning, and then I would barely make it home to see him go to bed at night. And so I didn't like that. And at that point, it was the one time in my career when it was difficult for me dealing with a particular manager. And I said, this isn't worth it. And I was thinking of leaving the business. And so then I actually tried to get a job with a hospital not so far from my home. I thought I could do media for them, communications, and I was a good producer. I could write. They didn't want to hire me. And I had been sort of told, like, when you're 50 or over, it's harder to get a job. So my mother suggested, why don't you just try to do 3 days a week? At least you'll be home more with your son. So during my son's high school years, I was working 3 days a week. But during that time, we had some really big news events that I was part of. When Osama bin Laden was caught and killed in 2011, it was a Sunday night. And, I went into work. My husband was home with my son, but I worked 24 hours straight. I ended up on the lawn of retired firefighter Bob Beckwith, who had stood on that truck with President Bush 3 days after 9/11 and, was part of history himself. He made the cover of Time magazine. So I got reaction from him out of his home on Long Island. So even though I was working 3 days a week, I was doing some big stories. And then by the time my savings started running out a little bit, my son was about ready for college. So I had a different manager, and I worked my way back up to being full-time on the air. And, my salary got a little better again, because when I went to 3 days a week, it wasn't pretty.
Yeah. And again, I commend you for that, because that's not easy. And shout out to all the working moms out there, and working dads too, but working moms especially. I saw it with my own mother. My mother raised myself, and my older sister's single. So the things that you guys have to go through, we can never repay you enough.
Yeah,
so.
My son had asthma, and I remember his asthma was the worst in the months after 9/11, because that smoke, whatever was traveling throughout the 5 boroughs, was impacting people. And I used to give him nebulizer treatments at night every 4 hours, and then I would have to get up and go to work. But, a child wants his mom oftentimes. And so I was the one giving him the treatments overnight. And of course, that's disruptive. But his health came before my lack of sleep.
Right. No, you hit the nail on the head there. And it goes to show a lot of us have had similar childhoods. Me too. Now, I wasn't living in New York. I had different reasons for my asthma. Same thing. Nebulizer treatments as a kid, mom being with me. You just triggered some childhood memories there I forgot about. But that went on for a number of years for me as well. So that's something both you understand as a mother, and of course my mother definitely, if she hears this, will understand as well when she hears that part. So I'm glad you mentioned bin Laden, because I was going to ask you about that, but you covered it pretty well. And Mr. Beckwith did pass away recently. I believe he was in his 90s. But yeah,
he had marked his 90th birthday. He was past 90. Yes.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And he was down there. He was retired by that point, but he came back like many retirees did to help out with the rescue and recovery efforts. So big shout out to him and his family. Definitely a legendary name within the FDNY's illustrious history. Now, this was something I wanted to spend some time on before we, of course, conclude with the rapid fire. You did have the Junior Guzman trial, and you covered that until its very conclusion, from when he was first murdered in 2018 until the final convictions of all those involved in his particular gruesome homicide, which captivated the city. It was a barbaric crime. And then, speaking of barbaric crimes, something that had been a mystery since the mid 90s, Gilgo Beach, a lot of these bodies washing up, usually, and there was a male victim that was discovered. His remains were mentioned today as part of the ongoing investigation. But usually wayward women who were involved in prostitution were being discovered murdered. The remains washing up on that particular beach.
Yeah, they didn't quite wash up. They had been dumped in the brush right off Ocean Parkway. They were all on the same side of Ocean Parkway, but the water was right there. So you're correct. They were right by the water. There was the bay, and then there was the ocean. They were on the bay side of Ocean Parkway.
Mm-hmm. And we didn't know for years, it was one of the big mysteries, who could be responsible for these crimes, because they weren't happening back to back to back. Time would pass by before the next victim. It appears that we finally have the answer to that question with the arrest of Rex Heuermann, who is currently I believe his trial hasn't commenced yet.
No, because they've added some other charges, and they're still looking to see if he's connected to the remaining victims. There are 3 victims that still haven't been identified, but they found the first victims in 2010, the Gilgo 4, and they were 4 women relatively close to each other in the brush off Ocean Parkway, and they were intact. They had not been dismembered or anything, but they were wrapped different parts of their bodies with camouflage burlap. But then Rex Heuermann was tied to 2 women whose torsos were found years back, one of them in 2000, one of them in 2003 in Manorville, which is 40 miles east of Gilgo Beach. But then their other body parts were found on Gilgo Beach on Ocean Parkway. So that's when prosecutors started thinking, okay, maybe this guy's involved. And so, there are so many unsolved cases that we know about some of them, but there are others we don't even know about. But what they've done is there were 10 sets of remains along Ocean Parkway, most of them in Suffolk County, 2 sets of remains in Nassau County. And then now they have these 2 women that were initially found out in Manorville, and then other body parts on Ocean Parkway. So he's been charged with 6 murders so far. 1 of them from the Manorville case, 4 of them from Gilgo Beach, the Gilgo 4. And then there was 1 woman we found out about in June of this year. She was found in 1993 in Southampton. And so now he's been charged with her murder based on hair DNA and other evidence. But, what came out this year, which was a pretty spectacular discovery, they have over 400 computers that they seized from Rex Heuermann's home, from his office, and from storage lockers near his home. And they were able to extract information from some of those laptops. And one of them was a so-called planning document that really, the prosecutors say, detailed a blueprint of what he wanted to do. The planning of the murders, the hunting for the women, the actual execution of the murders. They believe it happened in his basement in Massapequa Park. And then what to do to get rid of the bodies, but also to sort of limit any chance that he would be caught. But he got caught.
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
No, he ended up, the alleged killer. There's a lot of evidence. There's cell phone data, there's financial data, there's the DNA, which not only is tied to him through hair, but this man's wife and his daughter's hair was found on one of the victims. The wife's hair was found on 2 or 3 of the victims. So, the DA feels that he has a strong case, Ray Tierney. And today's press conference was about this Asian doe, who is the only biological male that was found among the 10 on Ocean Parkway. But he was dressed as a woman, may have lived his life, as a trans person. And so the forensic anthropologists that were utilized by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, they came up with this new sketch of what this person may have looked like. He was only between the age of 17 and 23, very slim, skeletonized. He was there since probably before 2006, probably more than 5 years before he was found.
disturbing to think about. And that was the thing that was mentioned that in the bulletin. It did say at least, as you just said, 5 years prior to his actual discovery
Yes.
in April of 2011. So this is something, and I thought the first murder was in 1996. No, it goes back further than that, 1993.
At least they're saying he's been killing since at least 1993, which would be over 30 years.
My goodness. And again, kind of like what we talked about earlier with the Steinberg case, not someone you would suspect. He didn't fit the profile per se. Here's someone that actually was a respected businessman in the city. I believe he was an architect, had seemingly a decent family on Long Island. He's the last person you would think about as a perpetrator of these kinds of crimes. But it goes to show you just never know someone. That was one of the things that was mentioned by his neighbors when he was first arrested. They were shocked. And that was something that a lot of people pursued. But, Rodney Harrison, who's no longer the Suffolk County Police Commissioner, but in the short time he was, did a heck of a job. That was something he saw through. He came in, he noticed the evidence. It had been a cold case for many years. He really pushed his detectives to really get to the bottom of it, and get to the bottom of it they seemingly did. Now, I say seemingly because, of course, as we know, innocent until proven guilty. He has not stood trial yet. But as you just said, D.A. Tierney does have a pretty strong case.
Yeah, and D.A. Tierney now has, I believe, 19 full-time members of that Gilgo Beach Homicide Task Force that are working out of his office on all the Gilgo bodies found on the Parkway, but also it's extended now beyond Gilgo, even beyond Suffolk County. And they're looking at a lot of other unsolved cases. I was told in the hundreds they're being asked to look at. And, obviously they're trying to solve Ocean Parkway because that's where the first victims were discovered. But this has just taken on a life of its own now.
Yeah, it has become lore, for better or worse. And of course, worse when you consider the amount of victims. It doesn't matter what kind of life they were living. People often look down on ladies or workers of the night because of their lifestyle. It does not mean anybody deserves to meet the fate these individuals met.
No, and everyone has a backstory. I mean, a lot of these women that turn to sex work is because they're survivors of trauma, or they were abused, or they were pushed out of their homes, or there are all sorts of reasons why people turn to sex work. And often it's an act of desperation. They need money. Some of these women that were found on Gilgo Beach dead, they had children, and one of the victims, I believe Megan Waterman, her daughter was maybe only around 3 years old when she died. Megan Waterman was only 22. And her daughter was at the press conference when they announced that Rex Uhrman was arrested for killing Megan and the other Gilgo 4 members.
We'll see what happens with that, but that was something I definitely wanted to ask you about. Now, you left, and as a viewer, I had 2 departures from Pix 11 that hurt me as a longtime viewer of the channel. Tamsin Fidel left, and she's doing great for herself in her pursuits now, and it's good to see that. She's having a wonderful second act post Pix 11. So I'm like, that hurt me as someone that watched her since I was 8 years old. And then you left on top of that, which was a double whammy. Now, it's important to note for the audience, Mary's not retired. This was not a retirement. You're still active in the news business. So this is a 2-part question. 1, 31 years in the place, a lot of love for it, a lot of memories there. How difficult a decision, if at all, was it to leave? And 2, after you mentioned that, tell the audience what you're up to these days.
It was a difficult decision to make, but I think it was the right decision. And I was in the local TV news business for 43 years in total, and on the air for 40. And because I care about my journalism and the stories I put out, I don't call it in. I really put my heart and soul into every story, no matter how big or small. And, I just had a sense in the last year of working full time that the grind was getting very difficult, a lot of traveling, a lot of traffic, getting up very early in the morning, getting up at 6 a.m., getting on the train at 7:30, coming home at 7:30 at night, because I would help with producing pieces for the shows that were on generally between 4 and 7. They would often play my story again at 10 o'clock. I worked with great people. I had a photographer that I was working a lot with on my special reports, and he ended up leaving 2 months before me and moving to California, John Frazzi. But I had been talking to my news director in February of last year, in 2023, telling her that I really thought that I wanted to have a more flexible life, be able to have the ability to spend time with family. My mother is 91 years old. She watched my entire career on the air. and she was my biggest supporter. I wanted to be able to be at her beck and call a little bit if she needed something. I didn't want to have to hang up the phone really quickly because I'm on deadline for a 5 o'clock news story. So I just looked at my life and I said, I can get a pension, but I don't have to be on local TV every day, but I could still work on projects that matter to me. So when I left, my goal was to perhaps come up with some ideas for documentaries or to consult if I had the opportunity on docuseries. I did consult on a couple of docuseries. Not that there's big pay involved or anything like that, but it was a nice experience. And on subjects that I know something about. And so that's what I would like to do. I'm trying to get my house in order. It's hard to maintain your home when you're working full time. My husband, doesn't make all these maids available for me. So I have to do what I can on my own. He does a little bit. And I just wanted a fuller life. I wanted to play tennis. And I wanted to be able to do projects I wanted to do. It's very demanding in local news. Our bosses have to fill airtime, and there's a lot of airtime now. There's more news hours than ever before. And I just felt like I had done a good job. I had left a good body of work over 40 years on the air. And I thought it was time for a new part of my journey. And I went on a nice trip to Norway and Copenhagen.
There you go.
But I just, as we were approaching the 1-year anniversary of the Gilgo Beach arrest of Rex Heuermann, I knew that I wanted to have a platform for where I could have my writing, my journalism. And so I created a website called Mary Murphy Official, marymurphyofficial.com. And the woman that I met 10 days before that first anniversary, I met her online accidentally. Her name is Shani Schwartz, and she actually has a company called Sharks Digital Media. She did a spectacular job in getting my website up with me within 10 days. And it was on the night before the first anniversary. Thank you for doing that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so, we have a piece on today about all the information that came out about Asian doe and the difficulties that law enforcement is having identifying this victim in Gilgo because, genetic genealogy has helped solve serial killer cases. And it's helped identify victims. But Asian doe, they're having a hard time with this person, this victim, because as we've been told, there's not a lot of Asian community DNA in these genetic genealogy sites. They don't tend to do it as much as other communities. So now there's this big push today. The Suffolk County District Attorney, Ray Tierney, put out 5 different posters. One is in English, but the other 4 are in various dialects of the Chinese language. There's one poster that's a dialect of Indonesian language. And so you can see this, all those posters have been put up by Shani and me today on this website, marymurphyofficial.com. One of the sections is called My Life of Crime. And my son came up with the idea for the title because basically I was never arrested, at least not yet, but but my life of crime, once a week, I do a story about something that moved me in my career or about a case that I've been on. And 9/11 was just this past week. So I did a story about meeting Vito, which looked at the first attack on the Trade Center, but then also moved up to 2001 when we had the second attack. And Vito's someone that will always stay with me.
Yes.
So My Life of Crime is the weekly blog. And then we have a section about Long Island serial killer, which is the one story that I'm really staying on top of. There's a section about Get Gotti because I was featured in the Netflix series. And so Shani thought that would be a good idea to include that. And then I have a section where people can contact me. And there's a section that I hope at various points that I can do some missing person stories, since that meant a lot to me too during my time at Pix 11.
Absolutely, and that's an important facet too that kind of plays perfectly into the Long Island serial killer ongoing investigation, considering that technically, even though remains have been discovered, they're still missing because we don't know who the person is, as was the case with today's discovery of the Asian doe, as they're known as for now, until they get their name back, as the already mentioned in your story. So I will link your website in the description of this episode, so those of you in the audience can go check it out and support it. And we certainly do appreciate all the support in advance that you will give Mary. She does a lot of great work, and so make sure you check out her website, please. So the hour and a half has flown by. It's been a heck of a conversation with you. I've enjoyed it immensely. I'm glad you finally made time to appear, because I know you're very busy. And again, tip of the hat to Chief DiBernardo for setting us up for tonight's interview. So it's now time for the rapid fire, which is 5 hit and run questions from me, 5 hit and run answers from you. You can say pass if you want. And we'll start with the first one. You mentioned one, I should say, earlier, which reuniting a mother and daughter is pretty darn uplifting. But besides that one, what's another favorite uplifting story you've covered?
Well, this wasn't an uplifting story, but it had uplifting facets to it. And you just mentioned Chief DiBernardo, and he's involved in this. In 2005, I covered one of the most memorable stories of my career, the Black Sunday fire in the Bronx. And there was also an incident in Brooklyn where a firefighter was also killed. But the Black Sunday fire, the one in the Bronx, happened on the day of freezing cold temperatures. There was a blizzard. The fire hydrants were frozen. The hoses got all tangled. There were partitions, illegal partitions in the apartments on the top floor where these 6 firefighters were stuck. And they all had to jump from this burning building in the Bronx. And 2 of them were killed that day, John Ballou and Curtis Myron. And the other 4 suffered, a lot of them, catastrophic injuries. Joey DiBernardo, who was Chief DiBernardo's son, I think he shattered every bone from his waist down, and his feet were particularly damaged. Jeff Kuhl, he was saved because Joey shared a rope with him. It was Jeff Kuhl's rescue rope, and Joey took it and broke a little bit of the fall for Jeff, who had 2 sons. And then there was Gene Stolowski, who jumped. His neck, I think it was broken, and he was paralyzed from the neck down for months, and he had to go to the special rehab in New Jersey, but he walked again. But during the time that he was in rehab, his twin baby girls were born, and he went home to see them on Father's Day, and it was one of the most beautiful stories I've ever seen. So there were moments of joy. Joey went to his sister's wedding and walked his mom down the aisle, and then Brendan Cawley. He was the probie. He was new on the job. His physical injuries were not as grave as the other 3 men who survived that day. But, he had a lot of emotional trauma, and his brother had died on 9/11, another firefighter in the family. So Joey DiBernardo, who survived the initial jump, he died almost 7 years later from his injuries. He had a lot of emotional and physical trauma associated with what happened on Black Sunday, but there were moments of joy that I got to cover in the year that I spent on that story, the initial year.
No, and Jeff's a friend of mine. I've had the fortune of interviewing Jeff too, and he talked about that day at length. And to remember from that story, Michael Cawley, Brendan's brother, killed on 9/11. Yes. He was a fireman, as you said. Kurt Myron, John Ballou, Richie Sclafani. He was not killed that day.
Sclafani was the firefighter in Brooklyn. Yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
Engine Company 290, Ladder 103. Richie worked there. He was killed in a basement fire in Brooklyn. And what was the deadliest day for the FDNY, January 23rd, 2005, since the events of September 11th, 2001. So uplifting stories too. And obviously Lieutenant DiBernardo, Rescue 3 guy. He was a Rescue 3 guy. He ended up passing away from his injuries in November of 2011. So he's considered a line of duty death as well. And they're not forgotten. What they did that day, heroic, unfortunate circumstances, but heroic response and heroic effort by those men that day. So they are definitely not forgotten. Third, best advice anyone's ever given you, either about the job or about life.
About life, and it applies to the job. You can't always be perfect. You're going to make mistakes in life. You have to learn from your mistakes. You're not Superwoman. You're not perfect. Get used to it. And so, I think I finally, I hope, became more human as I went along, because if you're too much like a machine, that's not good. You have to find a balance when you're a journalist, even when you're in a very high pressure job. And so I would say, you're not perfect, but learn from your mistakes.
Good advice. Something I'm trying to remember myself.
Yeah,
I
you're better rehearsed, and not, I shouldn't say rehearsed. You're better researched than me. I'm amazed at the facts that you're coming up with. Like, you're amazing.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate that. You're making my night. You're making my week and my year at this rate. Actually, I skipped over the second question. Tip of the hat to producer Victor that called me on that. So the second question, the rapid fire that I apologize for skipping over is, besides uplifting stories, there's plenty of funny ones in New York City too. What's one of the funniest stories you ever covered?
Oh God. I mean, I did a wrestling thing at, I can't remember I didn't do that many funny stories, but I remember once I asked, can I not do a murder? Can I cover something fun? And they sent me to Planet Hollywood when I was at Channel 2. The first Planet Hollywood, one of the first that opened, was on 57th Street. And Bruce Willis, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Sly Stallone, they were all there because I think they were partners in the business. And I'm getting these great one-on-one interviews with these guys that are big stars on the silver screen. I mean, when I'm not working, one of the ways I relax, I'm a real movie buff. And I used to be a wannabe film critic or reviewer because I just love movies. So we covered that, and it was late at night, and I got back to the station at 1 a.m. And when you know it, the sound didn't work. I had all these great interviews with these big stars. So somehow we had to try to get it from someone else, or maybe the network was there, and we had to patch it all together for the next day. At that point, we didn't have a 1 o'clock in the morning show on, but we had to get something on for the next day. So that was a funny thing that happened, but it wasn't so funny.
Well, yeah, at least it was able to be patched together. Now, skipping ahead, since I already asked the third question, to the fourth question. This is one where you could say multiple. You don't have to pick one. Favorite bar and or restaurant in New York City?
Oh boy. I mean, when I started out in the business, we used to always go up to the corner to Ryan McFadden. And because we used to go dancing there after the 11 o'clock show end. It was really a 10 o'clock show. It would end at 11. And then when I worked at Channel 2, we used to go to Kennedy's on 57th Street. But I'd have to say maybe my favorite was when I worked at Channel 2, no, CBS 2. All the girls, the producers, the reporters, all the young women, most of them weren't married at this point. We used to go to Wilson's on 79th Street and would dance up a storm and had a great time.
There you go. A lot of the nightlife clubs of yesteryear that are not around anymore, but remembered fondly by those who were there to experience them in real time. And fifth and finally, you kind of touched on it earlier, but you can expand on it here. If you could pull aside someone that's trying to get into the business or just got into the business, given your experiences over 40 years worth of them, what advice would you give someone looking to enter or having just entered your profession?
I would tell them that in this kind of a business, you can't just do banker's hours. Sometimes you have to be willing to make a call when you're off duty. When I started out and I wanted to do that first series on aging in America, I was 22 years old and I didn't go out that weekend. I stayed home and came up with ideas, concepts for a series. And the bosses liked it and I was able to do it. So it's not always a 9 to 5. That being said, I would advise them to find a way to try to balance your life the best you can, because it's important to your family. It's very difficult, but try to find some balance if it's at all possible. But at the same time, realize this isn't a 9 to 5 job, especially if you want to excel at what you do.
Wise words. Thank you very much for sharing them. Mary, stick around. We'll talk off air. But before I say goodbye to the audience, besides your website, of course, which we'll link in the description, any shout outs to anyone or anything you want to give?
And really, I just want to say thank you to all the people who shared their stories with me over the years, because if it wasn't for the people and if it wasn't for my sources, I wouldn't have lasted as long. So I'm extremely grateful to people that trusted me with telling their stories.
And thank you to them over the years. Thank you to you for all your contributions. I'd like to thank
I'll say one more thing.
Please do.
Anthony Santino, my son, my one and only. I love him. He's a good son. And he loves writing and producing comedy. And he's just now been doing a lot of videos on Instagram. His Instagram is @Anthony Santino. And he's starting to catch on a little bit. Some of his videos are going viral because he's a good writer. And so he's writing and filming these little skits with some other comics, and they're catching on. So it's @Anthony Santino on Instagram.
All right, I'll check him out. I like those skit comedies, so I'll definitely have to check him out, and we'll link his Instagram in the description as well of this episode for those of you in the audience that want to check it out as well. So thanks to everyone that tuned in tonight via YouTube and LinkedIn. As always, we appreciate you guys very, very much. Coming up next in the Mike the New Haven podcast, we don't currently have a guest for Friday. We'll work on it. There's a few different guests I'm juggling, and we'll see where the dates line up. As we mentioned earlier, currently the Best of the Bravest Nationwide Edition Volume 4 with current Special Operations Chief for North Hudson, New Jersey Fire Rescue, Al Pratz, is scheduled for Friday, September 27th, 6 p.m. It's supposed to be this past Friday. We'll do it ideally the 27th. So be on the lookout for that, and I'll keep you posted if we get a guest for this Friday and this upcoming Monday as well. For those of you listening on the audio side, tonight's outro song comes to you via the Talking Heads. It's off their 1985 album, Little Creatures, with And She Was. In the meantime, on behalf of Mary Murphy, and producer Victor, I am Mike Colón. We will see you next time, and have a great rest of your night. Take care.